Chapter 252. One Messed Up Ship. Friday, June 28, 1996 M.S. Nordam Fort Lauderdale, Florida, United States of America. Michael de Vries guided the Nordam back into the cruise port in Fort Lauderdale. It would take a long time for the utility crews to clean up the ship after this expedition. The crew quarters were a mess, and there was trash littering the hallways. Although the janitorial staff had done what it could to tidy things up, there were simply too many people, most of whom were panicked refugees instead of seasoned travelers, for them to do much good. A few windows had been broken, and many of the luxurious pieces of art Holland America had been counting on to welcome future mariners had mysteriously disappeared. The top deck's cocktail lounge now looked as if two werewolves had rampaged through it, not just one. The passengers had overwhelmed Half Moon Key's meager resources within a matter of hours. Fights had broken out over the little colorful cabanas on the beach, and the yellow one was now marked with a bloodstain. 3 of the kayaks had disappeared, as had a few of the bikes. The television set in the snack bar was missing, and there was virtually no food remaining on the island. The staff in Amsterdam couldn't decide whether to scream at him for wrecking the ship and the island or honor him for going out of his way to rescue frightened Floridians. He had been looking forward to getting all of the refugees off the boat. Unfortunately, it looked as if he was going to have to hold onto a few dozen for a little while longer. He really didn't want to do it, but it was the right thing to do. Most of the passengers were in the process of going through customs, so they could disembark and get back to what was left of their lives and their homes. However, about 50 of the refugees had hailed from Miami, and they had learned that their houses had been destroyed by the Cuban Death Eater's nuclear attack. He needed to keep them on board until he found someone or somewhere willing to house them. Perhaps he could put them to good use and have them help clean the ship up while they were there. Unlike most of the people who frequented the cruise line, a large number of them were in their 30s and 40s, and therefore much better qualified for physical labor. He had a suspicion that the ship would be heading to Atlantis at some point, as word had leaked out that Atlantis was in the process of constructing a district for Muggles to live in. The wizarding city had houses, and the Miami refugees needed some. A good 40 of them had already filled out the paperwork necessary to get them into the lottery. De Vries doubted that any of them would actually get in. Supposedly, there were already 50,000 people who had expressed interest in the magical city. However, he figured that Atlantis would expand the Muggle district when he realized the demand, which meant his passengers would probably wind up there at some point. He wouldn't be heading to Atlantis for a while, however. His next stop was going to be Key West, where the mayor had offered to provide temporary housing for the refugees. Had Judgment Day occurred in the winter, the Keys would have been thronged with tourists, and there would have been nowhere to put them. It was summer, however, and as a result, there were lots of rooms available down there. The last passenger disembarked, and de Vries turned the ship around and started it on its journey to Key West. He knew the cruise terminal there well, as it was a common Holland America tourist destination. However, this wasn't a pleasure cruise, and there wouldn't be any champagne brunches or glass-bottom boat tour awaiting his passengers their office of the President Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Charles Vest stared at the blueprints and whistled. I must say, Ms. Kurchatova, that's definitely different. The Russian house chuckled and looked at Guinevere. I thought you'd say that, sir. It's not often that you see blueprints which include magical supports in their construction. Vest frowned. I sure hope we don't have any engineers in the area who are going to be wondering what's keeping that part of the building up. Kurchatova rolled her eyes. We both know there aren't that many Course 4 students anymore. All of them are Course 6. Actually, sir, I would suspect that the architectural engineers would be intrigued by this. They could probably make a name for themselves by using magical supports in their designs. It's certainly different, as you said, and it lends itself to more unusual building designs. Vest looked more closely at the design again. I've noticed the low-rise is going to be hovering over a reflecting pool and a little park down there. How are the plants down there going to have access to sunlight? Guinevere smiled. Magic. Trust me, they'll grow. One of my friends in the soir was a gardener. Vest stared at the two women skeptically. I must say, ladies, that if you pull this off in 2 months, I'll be very, very impressed. You're sure you can do it? Kerchetova raised an eyebrow. The two of us probably can't. However, we've got a lot of friends who are willing to try. Besides, the alternative is... What? You expect to rebuild half of MacGregor, number 6, and a piece of Burton in 2 months without magic? Vest nodded. I get the point. What's the R-38 gas for? It's to prevent the magic from interfering with the electronics. Believe me, sir, most MIT students would take technology over magic every day. You should visit next house, where the world stops for Star Trek, the next generation. The president of MIT thought for a moment and finally smiled. Well, I say try it. If all else fails, we could put them in a hotel. Cooper residence. Harrison Cooper had a headache. This time, however, it wasn't because it was getting close to full moon. He had gotten it from reading the newspaper, which was currently in his wife's hands. Courtney read the headline of the article in shock. Nordham widow joins suit against British werewolf, charging him with her husband's murder. Harrison nodded. Now you see why I have a headache. This isn't going to be good, particularly if they ask for the death penalty. Oh, and did I mention that I'm going to turn into that monster again in a few days? Chapter 253. 4 slaves for the price of 3. Saturday, June 29, 1996, Seard Ashtate of Seard and Altry checked the defensive spells around him one last time. He'd never had to deal with free Muggles before, and he had to assume that the escaped Yahoos would ask the people on board the ship to help them fend off any attempt to recapture them. Chancellor Syatnan had introduced him to some nifty spells which would conjure strong force fields which would shield him from the nasty projectile weapons. Cold guns. Wick were favored by Muggle enforcement officials. He had his alibi in place. The tattoos on each Yahoo's forehead was a symbol representing the police in their homeland, Iceland. They were escaped prisoners who were armed and dangerous and needed to be returned to custody. He, Altry, was going to pose as a police officer and would ask for them to be rounded up. They were almost certainly on the boat, he thought. Muggles needed fairly complicated contraptions to fly, and he doubted that the boat had any of them on it. Granted, it was a very large boat. However, there were no obvious flying machines visible from the sky, and it wouldn't make any sense for Muggle flying machines to take off from inside the vessel. Drawing a deep breath, he turned on the spot and lurched through the air. Seconds later, he was standing on the deck of the ship. Seeing no one in the immediate vicinity, he cast a spell which would identify if the tattoo appeared anywhere in the area other than on his robe. It was a common, slave-catching technique. Not surprisingly, he got a positive response somewhere near the front of the ship. Oddly enough, there was only one response. What had happened? Had 2 of the slaves drowned and only one made it to the ship? That didn't make sense. The only explanation he could think of was that Syatnan and the rest of the government officials had made a mistake casting their spells. It wouldn't have been the first time the government had screwed up, he thought wryly. Wand in hand, he made his way over to the structure which the spell had indicated held the slaves. He suspected it was the bridge of the vessel. The captain would certainly want to help out a police officer, wouldn't he? It took him a while to figure out how to enter the structure. Eventually, though, he found the door and encountered his first free Muggle. The man stared at him in surprise and confusion. A wary expression appeared on the man's face, and he muttered something in an incomprehensible language. Altry swore to himself. He hadn't considered the possibility that these people wouldn't speak Seardani. He then thought about it and kicked himself again. Of course they wouldn't speak Seardani. They were Muggles. The Muggles didn't even know the island existed. This was going to be difficult. Trying to improvise, Altry pointed at the crest on his robe to see if the person recognized it. Judging from the man's reaction, the Muggle did indeed recognize it. His eyes widened and backed off and shouted something into the hallway behind him. Altry didn't know what the man was saying. Hoping against hope, he tried to ask him what was going on, using sign language whenever he could. Not surprisingly, the man looked at him blankly, shook his head, and said something. A few moments later, 3 other people raced into the hallway and looked at him. They were also free Muggles, as far as Altry could tell. He was about to launch into his alibi as a police officer when all 4 men reached into their pockets and pointed objects at him which looked like projectile weapons. All 4 of them shook their heads in unison and said something in a threatening tone. This didn't look good at all. Obviously, at least one of the Yahoos was on this ship. The Yahoo had apparently managed to get across the fact that he was trying to escape from a slave master, and the Muggles on the ship had decided to protect him. At the very least, they weren't going to tell him where the fugitive was. Altry knew what to do in situations like this. He'd dealt with irritated Yahoos in the past and had a lot of experience dealing with slaves. He brought out his wand and shouted Expelliarmus, and all of the weapons flew out of the Muggles' hands and clattered to the floor. Simultaneously, all of the lights went out all across the bridge. Kicking the projectile weapons aside, Altry looked at his wand in astonishment. Merlin's beard, what happened? He didn't tell them to turn the lights off. He looked up just in time to see one of the Muggles try to jump him. The attacker crashed into his defensive shield, grunted, and fell to the ground. Meanwhile, someone else suddenly hollowed down from somewhere else in the bridge. This was getting out of hand. He cast a sleep spell on the Muggles, followed by a revilio hominum to see where everybody else was. He had to find that fugitive as quickly as possible, and he would likely have to obliviate everyone once this was done to prevent the world from finding out about Círdan. The question now arose as to what to do with the sleeping Muggles. Suddenly, the answer came to him. He had lost at least 3 slaves, possibly 6. These fellows looked pretty strong. They'd be good servants and would make up for the people who had escaped. If he modified everybody else's memories to not remember these 4 existed, he might be able to get away with it. He would then bring these 4 back to Círdan and incorporate him into his household, along with any fugitives on the ship. In the meantime, though, he couldn't let the fugitive escape. Realizing suddenly that magic appeared to interfere with the Muggles' technology, he cast some spells which would wreak enough havoc to mess with the ship's power supply temporarily. He was not going to let this ship get to the United States, or wherever its destination was with that fugitive on board. If these Muggles wanted their ship back, they'd need to hand over the fugitive and allow themselves to be obliviated to remove any mention of Círdan, America for Humans Headquarters, Westboro, Kansas. The idea spread like wildfire. Although most of America for Humans had agreed that magic could be used for good in some cases, and that good wizards existed, the only way to ensure that magic was not abused was to force the wizards to police themselves. The vote was virtually unanimous, as the majority of the right-wing America for Humans members had defected to Judith Rogers' Revelation Party. Hours later, the new head of America for Humans was making a statement agreeing to halt all attacks on wizards agreeing to police themselves by taking unbreakable vows to obey the laws of the land. Wizards who took vows would be welcomed into society, whereas wizards who did not would be persecuted. Only time would tell if this would work. But it was better than nothing. Weird Sisters, recording Studiamold on the Wood, Great Britain. The 8 men in the Weird Sisters rock band agreed that there wasn't much use trying to popularize their music among the wizarding community anymore. After all, the whole English-speaking world knew about them. The Muggles, however, were an entirely different story. The Muggles didn't know about the band's music, and they would likely be blown away by all of the magic which accompanied a typical performance. From the Muggles' perspective, a Weird Sisters evening would combine aspects of a circus, magic show, and concert. It was time for a world tour, with benefits going to charities helping the cities attacked during Judgment Day. That would give the band greater visibility among the Muggles, and it would leave the members rolling in galleons or pounds once they performed their second tour. Chapter 254. Stern Wants a Job. Sunday, June 30, 1996, Sanders' residence of Prescott, Arizona, United States of America. Isaac Sanders had mixed feelings when Strong Bear informed him that he would be able to return to Fourth Mesa for work again. Two Bear, finally realizing that the emergency had passed, had relaxed some of the restrictions surrounding entry into the wizarding headquarters. Outsiders were once again allowed to come in via Flu Powder, which in turn meant Sanders could go back. He had liked working from home. However, the wizards had to go out of their way to come over to his house, and some of them weren't particularly thrilled about it. A couple of the women were actually pregnant, and they hadn't been able to apparate at all. Melissa, who was definitely showing by now, could relate to that. Furthermore, Dine Institute students who were underage hadn't been able to talk to him at all the whole time the quarantine had been in effect. Sanders couldn't help think that there had been a lot of impromptu baseball games and Quidditch matches during those free periods. The phone rang and Sanders picked it up. "Hello." The caller surprised him. "Izzy, it's Dave. How have you been?" Sanders whistled. He hadn't heard from David Stern for a long time. They had spoken a few weeks ago, but then Judgment Day and Blast Cola's new aggressive advertising campaign had gotten in the way, and both men had become quite busy. He wondered what was going on. "All right, Dave. I'll be allowed to return to Fourth Mesa pretty soon as they've relaxed some of the security restrictions over there. Melissa is definitely starting to show, and she's convinced it's a girl. I don't know how she knows that, though. Maybe she's a wizard." Stern laughed. "I wouldn't be surprised. At any rate, I was wondering if I could do you a favor. I think I'm going to need to look for a new job." Sanders froze. "What, a new job?" "Yup. We had a meeting at work on Friday, and we're told we're going to have to take a 10% pay cut because the economy is starting to tank. Some of the advertising promotions are going to have to be cut back, and I'm worried my job may be on the chopping block. Needless to say, introducing new products is not a particularly good idea during a freak economic depression. You work for the Department of Magic now, don't you? Part of the Muggle Outreach Program." "Yeah, Melissa and I teach Muggle studies in Fourth Mesa, though for the most part we've been having classes here of late because the facility's been in lockdown most of the time." Stern's request surprised Sanders. "You need any help? I wouldn't mind helping out the wizards, particularly since I apparently helped film the commercial which captured that kid on the broomstick in the first place." It took a second for Sanders to wrap his head around what Stern had said. When he did, however, his eyebrows shot up. "You don't remember, of course. You were obliviated." "That's what I'm suspecting, Izzy. I certainly could imagine myself trying to protect the wizard's secrets once the news came out. However, if one of those Oblivators panicked and wiped me before the statute of secrecy fell." "That's exactly what happened, Dave. Strong Bear told me that he got you at the Super Bowl and was on the verge of getting me as well, but changed his mind once he realized the cat was out of the bag. Thinking long-term, he deliberately disobeyed orders and brought me on board to help get the wizards accustomed to interacting with Muggles. As it turned out, that was the right move." Stern grunted. "I figured as much. Well, what do you think? Do you need some help?" Sanders thought about it. "I'm sure the wizards will be more than willing to accept your help, Dave. I'm just wondering where they'll station you. Would you be willing to leave the state? If I were Two Bear or Radner, I'd send you to a place which doesn't already have a Muggle representative." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "If necessary, I'll do it. What about that place in Sedona?" "Sedona falls under Fourth Mesa's jurisdiction, so they may be relying on me. However, it's not out of the question. There are 6 other locations, however, which may need help." Well, 4 Clarecarks got involved with Big Thicket, and I suspect Guinevere de Mornay's boyfriend and her popularity are taking care of the Northeast. I recognize Guinevere. She was one of the 2 chicks who saved Boston, but who's Claire Cox. She was a muggle attacked by America for Humans after they thought she was a witch. She was nearly killed. Ah, I remember that incident. Radner supposedly healed her and recruited her to help improve the wizard's public image. You've got a good memory, Dave. She's been helping us ever since, and she's been assigned to Big Thicket as a Muggle studies teacher. Chapter 255, Altry Flunks Swimming. Monday, July 1, 1996. Coast Guard Station Boston, Massachusetts, United States of America. Commander Michael Mershon stared at the report in surprise, then turned to the other Coast Guard officer. You've got to be kidding. A rogue wave hit the Big Texas and knocked 4 bridge officers overboard. The other officer nodded. Affirmative, sir. In all fairness, though, I can't imagine how any wave could be massive enough to cause serious damage to an oil tanker. Mershon frowned. I can't fathom how the wave could taken out bridge officers and only bridge officers. For one thing, I find it hard to believe that people would be washed overboard unless they were out in the open, and I wouldn't expect the bridge crew to be dawdling around on deck. Yes, sir. I can't argue with your logic there. I find it hard to understand myself, particularly since we were able to get a radio response from the ship several hours later, but we got one. Think about it, sir. The main radio station is located on the bridge. If the bridge was flattened by a rogue wave, how did they send the signal? Mershon's frown deepened. You know, Lieutenant, that's a very good point. Something very strange is going on here. Did any epiubs go off in the area? The other officer shook his head. No, sir, which is also surprising. You'd have expected a wave that big to knock some of those into the water and activate them. However, there's even a more obvious piece of information which doesn't seem to make sense. Oh, what's that? Sir, there's no oil slick. You'd expect any damage to an oil tanker to cause a major oil slick. Yet none of the satellite images over the past 24 hours show any sign of an oil slick in the area. What's more, the most recent satellite image still shows the ship heading for Boston. It's a little behind schedule, but it's still en route, and it doesn't seem to have any obvious damage. Mershon didn't like this. Something fishy was going on here, and he intended to figure out what it was. He suddenly realized he'd discussed this particular vessel earlier. It had been the one which had stumbled across 3 people on a raft, which didn't speak any language known to anyone at either Harvard or MIT. The communication barrier with the Searden family was still formidable. However, it was now obvious that they had been running from something and had been treated very badly by whatever it was. Had the entity chasing the refugees done something to the ship, thinking they were on board? If so, was it going to follow the refugees to the American mainland? This did not sound good, not good at all. His train of thought was interrupted by the arrival of another man who saluted, handed him a document, and left. Puzzled, he asked the officer he was speaking with to wait a moment while he read it. Urgent bulletin. 5 bodies pulled from water 5 miles from Jekyll Island, Georgia. 3 males and 2 females. All were carrying wands. Repeat, all were carrying wands. Preliminary indications suggest wizards attempting to portkey into the country, but failing to get through the protective barrier and materializing in the ocean. All 5 people had distinctive dress similar to that used by wizards, and one of them had a symbol on his robe similar to that tattooed on the heads of the people rescued from Big Texas. Mershon's eyebrows shot up. This sounded like a wizarding manhunt or a possible invasion. This was worse than he thought. Whistling, he handed the document to the lieutenant, and the lieutenant stared at the paper in shock. Good God, sir, are you thinking what I'm thinking? We've got wizards trying to get into the country and chase those refugees down. Mershon nodded. That's what I'm thinking, Lieutenant. Voldemort probably had a secret base hidden somewhere in the Atlantic. These fellows we picked up probably tried to escape or warn us, and the Death Eaters are on their tails making sure they don't succeed. Where are the Seardens right now? Public housing in Dorchester, sir. Good, so they're still in the area. Get in touch with them again and bring them in. Send a plane out to check on that tanker. And tell Radner, or at least Ariadne if Radner is busy. Make sure a wizard is here for the next interview, at the very least to help translate if necessary. At the rate things are going, we'll probably need a magic spell to figure out what these guys are saying. Fourth Mesa, Strong Bear groaned. David Stern. Well, well, well. I remember him very, very well. Unfortunately, I doubt he remembers me. Sanders grunted. You obliviated him, didn't you? Yes, I did. Granted, it was just after I saw the commercial on the television monitor in the arena, and I panicked a little. He's a good man, Mr. Sanders. I realized that obliviating him had been a mistake shortly after recruiting you, but at that point, there was nothing I could have done. Will you be willing to take him on? Strong Bear nodded fervently, but Two Bear thought for a moment. Although it behooves us to bring him back and compensate him for what we did to him, I don't think he'll be able to do much good here at Fourth Mesa. After all, we've already got a Muggle Studies professor here. It would make more sense to send him somewhere which doesn't currently have a Muggle representative. Sanders nodded. I told him that. Do you have somewhere in mind? Yes, Mr. Sanders. Unless I'm very badly mistaken, Diana Simmons of the MT. St. Helens facility does not yet have a Muggle ambassador. Would he be willing to move up there? I'll ask him. However, I can tell you already that he loves to travel. I suspect he'll take the job. Werewolf Rehabilitation Center, Hogsmeade. The wolfsbane potion was a godsend, Harrison thought. Although he still had urges to bite people, he at least knew what he was doing and was able to restrain himself. He knew what to expect now, and this time wasn't taken by surprise when he transformed into the monster. It still hurt, of course, but he knew that the pain wouldn't last long. Looking at the Morse code chart on the ceiling, he barked a message to the humans thanking them for creating the wolfsbane potion. Content, he curled up in a ball, put his tail between his legs, and fell asleep. Chapter 256, Lead to Gold. Monday, July 1, 1996, Herald Green Pharmaceutical Corporation, Charleston, South Carolina, United States of America. David Hendrickson looked at the little note scribbled in the margin of Dr. Flamel's manuscript. He didn't know whether to be worried about it or amused. Do not change lead into gold, or our Lord Jesus Christ will punish you for your greed. I grew weak, lost my hair, and felt the burning touch of the Lord's wrath. If you must do so, use mercury, and do so under the following conditions. First, let it sit for 2 weeks, douse all open flames, and then siphon off the top 1%. The note went on for a while, and Hendrickson eventually grew tired of reading it. For one thing, he didn't have any mercury to play with, only lead. Furthermore, Mr. Green was getting impatient and wanted to hear an update as soon as possible. Finally, Hendrickson doubted that Flamel had actually suffered a supernatural punishment as a result of his experimentation. He'd probably gone bald, that's all. It happened to most men. Still, it didn't hurt to be cautious. Putting on something the Muggles called an X-ray suit, which was probably overkill and additional protective gear, he picked up his wand and walked over to the bar of lead sitting on the workbench. He followed the instructions to the letter, placing the stone on top of the lead and drawing the appropriate mystical symbols around it. Finally, when all was ready, he tapped the stone with the end of his wand and shouted, "Orify." There was a flash of light and a brief burst of heat. When it had subsided, a bar of gold was sitting on the workbench. It was surrounded by a narrow corona of silvery powder, which slowly began to turn gray as he watched. The powder's behavior reminded him a lot of the elements lithium and sodium. However, this powder was doing things neither lithium nor sodium did, such as disappearing before his eyes and changing color. He barely had time to register surprise at this when alarms started hollering all over the lab. A few feet away from Hendrickson, a large machine started crackling wildly. What the hell? He looked around the room to see what was going on and saw the other technicians staring at flashing red sign with 3 triangles on it. Underneath, it was the word radiation. Seconds later, people were shouting and stampeding out of the room. Hendrickson shook his head and turned back to the workbench, where most of the powder had disappeared. He was about to examine the gold further when one of his coworkers grabbed him by the arm. "David, get out of here. There's been a radiation leak." Hendrickson looked at him. "A what?" "Radiation. Shit. You're a wizard, so you probably don't know. Basically, there are invisible particles racing through the room right now which can kill people if they're exposed to them for too long. You've been lucky so far because you've been wearing that X-ray suit, but it won't last forever. Hurry, run, and shit the door." Hendrickson stared in confusion as the technician let go of his arm and ran towards the exit, where, much to Hendrickson's dismay, a large metal door was slowly sliding shut. Although he figured that these particles wouldn't interfere with his spell work, he couldn't afford to take any chances, and he didn't want to risk whatever disease the man had been screaming about without magic to protect him. Making up his mind to hurry, he placed his hand on the gold bar so he could put it in his pocket and show Mr. Green his work on the stone was complete. He shrieked in surprise, and the bar fell from his gloved hand. For some reason, it was very hot. Praying his wand still worked, he used a summoning charm to bring over a small box, pushed the bar into the box with his wand, and closed the lid. He then sprinted for the door and managed to make his way out of the lab just before it sealed off the room. What the hell was that all about? Shrugging, he was about to head off to show the bar to Mr. Green when he realized that he should probably capture some of that powder before it all disappeared. Turning back towards the door, he tried to push it open. However, it wouldn't open. Worse still, the Alohomora charm didn't seem to do much good, as there wasn't a lock on it. And judging from the looks the other technicians were giving him, opening that door at this point would probably be a bad idea. One of the other scientists looked at his suit, and the man's eyes widened. Pointing at a readout on Hendrickson's suit, he shouted, "Jesus Christ, that's one hell of a dosage. It's probably survivable if we act fast enough. Let's get to the hospital stat." Hendrickson was dragged along by the flood of people heading towards the infirmary. What the hell was the man talking about? United Nations, Building Geneva, Switzerland. Anastasio's Dialynis knelt at the center of the room. In his 75 years of existence, he had never thought that he'd be in a situation like this. Dialynis had been raised Greek Orthodox. However, he had no idea that the church even had knighthood. Furthermore, in all of the confusion surrounding Samuel, the 2 popes, and the Cohen Gadol, he had completely forgotten that Orthodox Patriarch of Jerusalem was still around. Apparently, someone in the church had decided to knight him. So they brought out the Patriarch, told Dialynis to kneel, and announced that he was now considered a knight of the Holy Sepulchre. Dialynis had no idea what to say. He personally thought that Suleiman I was much more deserving of such a title than he, Dialynis, was, but it seemed as if the Muggles were going to insist on this as a reward for saving the planet during Judgment Day. People cheered for a good 5 minutes as he knelt there on the ground. Dialynis had no idea what he was supposed to say and just knelt there, speechless. Still on his knees, he watched as the Greek representative stepped forward and put a big medal around his neck. Cameras, both Muggle and wizarding, flashed everywhere. The Grand Mugwump thought it was a nice gesture, but he wasn't sure what exactly do with the thing. Perhaps he could make it part of the Grand Mugwump's formal attire for his successors. Finally, Kofi Annan walked to the podium and told Dialynis to rise. The Secretary-General of the United Nations spoke 3 sentences, but he brought everyone in the room to his or her feet. "Wizard Dialynis, we would like you to join the United Nations as the ambassador to and representative of Atlantis and the wizarding community. Now that the Muggles and wizards will be interacting once again, it is imperative that this body take the advice of the wizards into consideration when determining how exactly the world is to be run. What do you say, Sir Anastasios? Dialonis was floored. He wasn't entirely sure how well he'd be able to handle this, but if anyone was capable of fulfilling this role, it would be he. He was about to have a few Muggle ambassadors in Atlantis's governing council, after all. It was only fair for the wizards to return the favor. He nodded, and the crowd roared its approval. Dialonis made it a point to nominate Dagher for the next Grand Mugwump and have Dagher's deputy take over as the Saudi Minister of Magic. Endukaku was better known, but he was inexperienced, having just been elevated to head astrologer just before Judgment Day, and his elevation would force the astrologer's key into the hands of Endukaku's deputy, someone whom Dialonis thought was not yet up to the task Salem Witches Academy Enfield. Persephone Ariadne looked at the report. Refugees with tattoos arrive, speaking strange languages and appearing seemingly out of nowhere in the middle of the Atlantic. They're granted citizenship and asylum in the United States. A little while later, other people with tattoos trying to break into the country in pursuit of the refugees. This second group crashes into the Portkey barrier and drowns itself in the Atlantic. There was only possible explanation. The United States had stumbled across some Ciudadani, and it was only a matter of time until Clinton found out that some of the wizards kept slaves. This was going to be ugly. Study of surface Artsexequides Manor, downtown Rockter-Rattle, city-state of Rockter-Rattle. Refreshed after a good night's sleep, Thune Lentz entered the study visibly reinvigorated. It was about time he got some rest. After spending 3 days in a row debating ideas with Jeer in the Siren's workshop, with virtually no shut-eye. Speaking of which, he saw a lot more equations on the numerous blackboards hanging from the walls, and he had to step over ankle-high piles of papyrus scrolls full of sketches as he progressed towards the table. There, surrounded by an extremely large and apparently chaotically arranged mass of scrolls and tomes, lay the study's owner, who, from the looks of it, succumbed to fatigue in the middle of reading an obscure Ciudadani record detailing animated statues, and snoring in a decidedly unhealthy tone. Sighing in resignation, he grabbed the sleeping merman and dragged him to the nearest paper-free spot on the floor, then pointed his wand at Jeer's face and yelled, "Aguamenti!" The Zuckwudis scholar woke with a start and looked around wildly with surprised and panicked eyes. His gaze settled on his friend, and after swallowing a mouthful of refreshing water, he gathered himself and calmly addressed the Spedanian, but his voice was audibly hoarse. "And a good morning to you too, Thune. Did I fall asleep again? Damn right you did, my friend, and I'm starting to feel concerned for you. You sound really dry when you sleep, and now even awake. Believe it, I feel really dry too. Why don't you take a swim outside? You've stayed inside the bubble for what, 2 days now? 1 day, 22 hours and 7 minutes. I'm still good to go. The hell you are. Your designs will wait for you, and I'll too, in fact. I refuse to work with you until you take a swim. All right, but just because you insist." With that, the Siren moved out of the study and made his way towards the nearest airlock. Damn bull-headed workaholic. He'll end up suffocating or starving to death someday. But not while I'm watching over him, the wizard said to no one in particular as he picked up a parchment from the table. At first, he couldn't make heads or tails of the drawing on it. Then the wizard realized he's looking at a close-up of a mechanical spider's leg, a heavily upgraded spider's leg. He counted at least 2 blades, a hook, and even what appeared to be folded swimming webs, which were concealed in the appendage according to the design. Hearing his friend's return, he turned towards him and was relieved to see how even such a short time in the sea refreshed Jeer. "You like my work?" Thune gestured around the room. "You've been most productive last night. But do you really think it's necessary to arm a civilian vehicle so heavily? Those aren't weapons, just tools. If my calculations are correct, I'll be able to climb rocks and trees with them, if you say so. But you can't use those in the ambassador model. Some cultures don't value concealed weaponry on diplomats like yours. My friend, just tell me, why would I need to conceal a puny 5-inch blade in the walker's leg when its grip can shatter bones? Redundancy, for one. Fair enough, smirked the siren. Tell me, are the calming runes still working? Instead of answering verbally, Thune put a box on the table and opened the lid. Inside, there were 2 chocolate frogs, one of them with miniature symbols adorning its back, the other unmarked. The latter one jumped out just a heartbeat after it looked around and tried its best to get away. The marked one looked around too, but it stayed in place and only jumped away when the wizard reached towards it, and once it jumped into a safe distance, it stopped moving again. It works, and it will stay this way until the seal is removed. Of course, the animation charm will wear out soon, but another seal will make it permanent just like that. Your perfect mechanic riding spiders will be mobile and tame forever this way. Brilliant. One detail just bugs me, though. What happens if the seal is broken by damage? The spell it preserves will go away harmlessly. Why? Well, while I insist those tools in its legs are not weapons, I'd rather not be close to an animated mechanic acromantula equipped with them when its calming charm dissipates. Point taken. I'll combine the enchantments, so if one seal is broken, the other one automatically dissolves. This way, instead of going on a rampage, it'll just shut down. Harmless enough for you. Fine, you draw up the combined seal while I assemble the prototype. I'll be at the forge if you need me. Right, I'll join you there. This won't take too long. Please try not to fry yourself while waiting for me. Chapter 257. Every Man Comes Home. Monday, July 1, 1,996,169, South Street, Waltham, Massachusetts, United States of America. Dragged my suitcase up the stairs and back into my apartment in Waltham. I had only been in Curacao for a couple of weeks, yet the entire world had changed in the meantime. Several cities had been hit with nuclear weapons, including New York. John Tatelman, who had been living in the Upper West Side, was stuck at his parents' house in Newton for the time being because his apartment building had taken some damage and was waiting for federal and magical inspectors to make sure that it was safe for him to return home. He had been shielded from the blast and initial radiation pulse itself by being in a building and had suffered minimal radiation exposure. He had been very, very lucky. His mother, of course, was acting like a traditional Jewish mother and was trying to make sure he wasn't out of her sight, something which irritated him to no end. My father lost a few distant cousins in Tel Aviv, and a couple of people in Haifa had run for the hills as soon as the dirty bomb had gone off. I hadn't known these people all that well, however. Some of my mother's friends had been killed in the Miami blast, though Lee Moses had managed to escape to the Ocala National Forest wizarding facility. The wizards had tried to do what they could, but she had been placed in cramped quarters and was happy to leave. She wished she could have taken some of the magical artifacts, but Kenneth Franco, the man in charge of the facility, explained that the artifacts had to stay put until the wizards determined how safe they would be in Muggle hands. Judging from the bizarre and amazing things I had seen in the annex behind my grandfather's house, I wasn't surprised. No one had yet determined how exactly magic worked. Supposedly, several wands, brooms, and packets of flu powder had made it into scientists' hands, and the physicists were working with them around the clock. There was an unconfirmed that wands tended to cause the gravitational constant around them to increase at a rate significantly greater than that expected from another object of the same mass. Could magic be exploiting a new physical process or law which neither Newton or Einstein had noticed? For the first time in a long time, I regretted having switched from physics to computer science. Had I stayed in physics, I would have been in the forefront of this new development. The events of Judgment Day had altered the world's geography. There were now several lakes on the map which hadn't been there before the 20th, most notably Lake Scrimgeour in the center of London. They had altered the world politically as well, as Israel was in absolute chaos and North Korea had virtually ceased to exist. Word had just come out that the South had organized a plebiscite, which would allow the people in the North to vote for an interim president and to determine whether the country wanted to stay communist or transition to democracy or some other form of government. The vote had been scheduled for August 1st. In the meantime, the 1st Division of the Wizards' Standing Army was separating the two sides and serving as a mediator. Saddam Hussein had been allowed to occupy a small disputed piece of land in recognition of his help with Judgment Day, and he had issued a statement stating that he would welcome all Muslim wizards into Iraq. Meanwhile, Hosni Mubarak had been given control of the Habibite Triangle, a disputed area near the border with Sudan. The idea of Saddam Hussein welcoming in Muslim wizards worried a few people, including many of my friends. Although the vast majority of Muslims were peaceful, the one man I knew from MIT who supported the Palestinians said that although he was Palestinian, he wasn't crazy enough to get involved in the West Bank. Everyone knew that several of the Indian Death Eaters had been Muslim. What would happen if Saddam found himself ousted or imperiused by the surviving Death Eaters? Judging from the fact that the price of gas was now $3.16 a gallon, it sounded like several oil speculators were rather nervous about this possibility. The fact that a rogue wave had struck an oil tanker in the middle of the Atlantic, killing 4 crewmen, hadn't helped. I was more worried about my job than the situation in the Middle East. People were being laid off in droves, and the stock market was down 37% since before Judgment Day. As a new employee, having been at Parametric less than 5 months, I could very easily be the first to go. If all else failed, I could go back and finish my PhD at Brandeis. Hopefully, that would keep me occupied until the dust settled. The girl I knew from Russian House had continued to do things I couldn't believe. She had apparently decided to celebrate her graduation by saving a few million people from radioactive fallout and helping plan a newly renovated MacGregor. Dee Janich had supposedly been dispatched on a peacekeeping mission, as had been Dina Disraeli. And most amazing of all, the idea of producing force fields to create fallout shelters had been developed by a 16-year-old girl from England, one who supposedly had caught the eye of Prince William, now King William V. I figured I'd start heading back to work tomorrow. I wondered how many people would be there, 80%, 90%. Erin was going to be coming in, as was Matt. However, I suspected that people had gone home to New York during as the fighting with Voldemort had been winding down. If they didn't come back, well, we'd know for certain. I headed to the supermarket to stock up on some groceries and was surprised to see that the prices had gone up drastically. I had a decent salary, now much better than the one I had had as a PhD stipend, but the discovery still made me a bit uneasy. Presumably, it was a combination of the high oil prices, the world instability, and the disruption of the supply, road, and rail networks caused by the nuclear explosions. The place was packed, as it appeared that several people had had the same thoughts my family had and were just coming back to see if their houses were okay. There were rumors among my Brandeis friends that several people I knew may have been killed in Tel Aviv and New York. I didn't know for certain, but I figured I'd find out soon enough when everyone came back to class in September. My friends had lucked out during their stay in Israel during the Gulf War, as they had been studying in seminaries in Jerusalem when scuds were falling in Tel Aviv. I had a suspicion that they wouldn't be as lucky this time. I was more than intrigued about Grand Mugwump, now Ambassador Dionysus's declaration that there would be a lottery which would allow 3,000 Muggles to move to Atlantis. Judging from what I had seen in the Wizarding Annex, I figured I'd have liked it. However, odds were that even if I did enter my name, I wouldn't be chosen. Supposedly already 500,000 people had entered. Oddly enough, many of them had been from the Ukraine, of all places. That didn't really make all that much sense, as that nation had not taken any nuclear hits. The world works in mysterious ways, I mused, and it would continue to do so. How else would the Boston Coast Guard manage to pluck a bunch of foreigners out of the middle of the Atlantic, with no land in sight? Shrugging, I headed to the checkout line to buy my goods border zone city state of Rattle, Indian Ocean, east of Seychelles. The last rays of the setting sun shined through the pristine waters of the Indian. Below the ocean's gentle waves, giant strands of tropical kelp reached towards the surface from the dim depths, slightly rocking to the waves' rhythm. For many of the myriad animals living on and around them, it was just a silent, ordinary dusk. For the lone tiger shark swimming slowly but purposefully along the edge of the underwater forest all day, it felt like something more, something tasty. Its fine-tuned senses picked up a good-sized body's erratic moves, along with the distinctive aroma of blood in the water not 5 minutes ago. Being the apex predator of these waters, the fact that he, for it was a male, had never before swum in this forest, didn't concern him. His exceptional senses were more than enough to let him sense his surroundings, and no prey was foolish enough to fancy itself the hunter of a mature tiger shark. Hearing the irregular splashes closer and closer, and smelling more and more of the alluring scent of blood, his already simple mind's tracks narrowed down to the question of food. He came at last to a small clearing between the strands of macroalgae, and his sharp eyes finally confirmed what his other senses told him since what felt like an eternity in tantalizing hunger. A lone dolphin, seemingly injured or ill, resting just below the surface, visibly having trouble even just staying there. Focusing on his prey, the shark's senses picked up several other dolphins, unmoving, hiding in the kelp at the edges of the clearing. But they didn't stand in his way, so he didn't care. Had he been a marine biologist, he'd have wondered why they left their fellow pod member to suffer alone. Had he been a smaller shark, he'd have considered the hiding dolphins a threat. Had he been a decent tactician, or Eric Bauersfeld, he'd have screamed, "It's a trap," at the top of his lungs. But he was neither, and he didn't have lungs. Being just a big, hungry shark, he slowly circled in the darkening waters, so his striped body hid him from the unsuspecting prey, and as the darkness of night finally took over, he began his ascent behind the dolphin's tail. For the red squad of Rattle border defense, the dusk was neither silent nor ordinary. If all went according to plan, their trainee, Tony Kexitalo, code name Red 2, had his initiation this night. Completely inaudible to human, tiger shark, or most animals for that matter, the border waters were full of quick, high-frequency clicks. The noises were those associated with regular dolphin sonar, but these had a different pattern, somewhat similar to human Morse code. Translated, they would be like this. As the shark finally burst up toward his prey, several things happened in short succession. The struggling dolphin, Aka Red 3, darted sideways away from the shark. At the same time, a so far apparently hiding dolphin, Aka trainee Tony Kexitalo, Aka Red 2, lunged toward the back of the shark, shapeshifted to merman, and slashed the left gills of the shark clean through with a knife, evoking a quick from another dolphin. Momentum carried the sharked predator on, over the surface, only as its mouth catched empty air instead of flesh, and agonizing pain shot through its body. Did it realize it's in trouble? As the shark fell back in the water, already dazed from its injured respiratory organ, it say dark red mist all around him, and over that, hazy images of dolphins coming forward, changing shape to humanoids holding pointy sticks, throwing them at him. Then nothing. It was midnight when Red Squad's shift ended, and they began their journey home to their barracks in the outskirts of Rattle. They swam slowly with their burden, along with the very dead tiger shark. They carried several smaller ones, speared to death as the big one's blood lured them in the area. With the sole exception of some blood in a tightly closed jar given to Yellow Squad to repeat their stunt, they left nothing behind. It would have been a sin to waste any of that good meat, shark skin, and teeth. They'll get good money for those in the market tomorrow. But first things first, they had a feast tonight, celebrating the successful initiation of Tony Kexitalo, Red 2, full member of Red Squad. Chapter 258. The Refugees Get an Interpreter. Tuesday, July 2, 1996, Coast Guard Headquarters, Boston, Massachusetts, United States of America. Next Pav. 259. Radna Persephone Ariadne had to scour the Salem Witches Academy, followed by half of Enfield, to find someone fluent in Ciudadani. The Ciudadani were generally very isolationist, and for good reason. Most of the other wizarding nations frowned upon what they were doing to the Muggles, after all. Ariadne wondered how Muggles all around the world would react if people found out about the Centaur state in the Pacific, which discriminated against virtually all humans. She thought back briefly to the history of Círdan. Supposedly, the inhabitants of Friesland had been in relatively poor condition when the wizards had first arrived, and the wizards had naturally taken it upon themselves to see what they could do to help out. Eventually, a feudal government developed, with the Muggles in the position of the serfs and the wizards in the position of the lords. The Muggles were soon accustomed to higher taxes in exchange for magical services and tools which they had never even dreamed of. Time had gone by, however, and the wizards had become corrupt, appropriating more and more power from the Muggles. The final blow had come in 1277, when a Muggle revolt prompted the wizards to enslave the Muggles for good. There had been a few uprisings since then, and all of them had been squelched before they could gain enough traction to overthrow the government. At this point, the entire country's way of life was based on slavery, and it would be difficult to undo the damage caused by centuries of servitude. The door to the supervisor's office was open, and she knocked on the wall to announce herself. The man had a short black beard and a military bearing. His uniform had the name Mershan on it. He stood up and shook her hand. "You must be the delegation from the Quabbin." "I'm Michael Mershan, the head of this facility." Ariadne nodded. "I'm Persephone Ariadne, Deputy Secretary of Magic. I work for Travis Radner. The man next to me here is Leonard Perman, someone who specializes in unusual languages." She had deliberately refused to make any reference to Círdan at this point, and convinced the interpreter to do the same in his translations, as long as there were Muggles in the room. What the Muggles didn't know couldn't hurt them, after all, and it would be a major diplomatic faux pas to expose a wizarding location to the Muggles without permission. The only people who needed to know would be Radner and the President, who would keep the information classified. Furthermore, both she and the interpreter were dressed in Muggle clothing. She figured that if they were Ciudadani, they would be frightened of wizards and try to run if that were the case. They would carry their wands in their back pockets, however, just in case. Mershan looked at the interpreter and nodded. "I must say, Mr. Perman, you're going to need it. No one here seems to have gotten anywhere without extensive use of sign language. All we've been able to tell so far is that they appear to have been running from something and that their names are unpronounceable. To that end, we've given them American names which sounded remotely like their real ones. I'd recommend that you address them by these names to get them accustomed to life in the United States." Perman approved of this. "That's a good idea. What are their names?" "The man's name is Alexander, and the woman's name is Ursula. They're in their mid-30s. The kid's name is Petunia. She's 9 and doesn't want to let that doll out of her hand. We've given them the last name Círdan, as that appears to be the name of their clan." The two wizards looked at each other sharply. Mershan noticed this and raised his eyebrows. "Do you know these people?" It took Perman a good 3 seconds to figure out what to say. "I think I'm familiar with the clan. It's a very obscure wizarding family, and there's no way you could have known. Fortunately, I know enough about that family to speak their language." Mershan whistled. "Are they royalty or something like that? If so, what were they doing dressed in rags and running from stuff? Was there a coup in their country? If they're wizards, where are their wands? And what were they doing in the middle of the Atlantic?" Ariadne shrugged. They're not royalty, they appear to be commoners. They also appear to be muggles, not wizards. Muggle commoners and wizard rulers, eh? That makes sense. All three of them have tattoos on their foreheads, and we dragged one fellow with the same symbol on his wait a minute. Are they Death Eaters? I've heard that Death Eaters have tattoos. If that's the case, you're going to need some backup. Perman shook his head. No, Mr. Mershon, the tattoos are tribal in origin. I wouldn't worry about it. Ariadne needed to cut this off in a hurry. The man was getting too curious. Listen, we're a bit pressed for time, so if you don't mind, we'd like to start talking to these people. From what you've told us, it's increasingly likely we'll be able to get through to them. Mershon nodded. I hope you can follow me. The officer then led Ariadne and the interpreter down the hall towards an empty lounge. Looking over his shoulder, Mershon asked, If it's all right with you, I'm going to listen in on the interview. Ariadne shook her head. No, thank you, but I don't think it will be necessary. We can take care of it. Mershon shook his head. You probably can, Miss Ariadne. Unfortunately, I have my orders, and believe me when I tell you that a lot of people, including the president, are curious about these three. Besides, they trust me now. Ariadne grunted. They'd have to be pretty careful here. Saying that she'd think about it, she followed him into the lounge, where the three refugees were sitting on a couch. She cursed to herself. They were Ciudadani, all right. She recognized their garments as tattered slave clothes. She didn't recognize the tattoo on their foreheads, but that was understandable, as there were thousands of slaveholders on that island. Their owner could have been one of the less affluent wizards. She was about to introduce herself when there was a flurry of movement on the couch. Seconds later, all three of them were lying prostrate at Perman's feet and whimpering. Mershon stared at the refugees. What the hell? Ariadne had to improvise. They think we're royalty, apparently. I can't get into that much detail, but the wizards appear to be the upper class in this clan. Lenny, could you do us a favor and tell them to calm down? Perman nodded and barked something unintelligible at the refugees. They stared at him in astonishment, then skepticism. The woman then pointed at him, said something, and put her head back on the ground. The interpreter swore, reached into his back pocket, and noticed that the top of his wand had been sticking out of his pocket. Turning to Ariadne, he said, They realize we're wizards and don't trust us. Throw away your wand. They think you're going to hurt them. Ariadne reached into her pocket, withdrew her wand, and threw it across the room. Both wizards then opened their hands to show that she was unarmed. Meanwhile, Mershon stared at the wizards in shock. God almighty, not only do you speak their language, but they don't trust wizards. What happened over there? Were they running from Death Eaters? Were they tortured by Voldemort's men, enslaved, forced to worship wizards as their kings, and somehow managed to escape? Ariadne gritted her teeth, which gave Mershon the opportunity to press on. That's it. Voldemort had a secret base in the Atlantic, and his men are using it as a final hideout. They've taken control of the area and are subjugating all the Muggles. We need to tell the president about this. Tell them we're going to get all the rest of their family members out of there. Is there anything you can do about it? Ariadne and Perman looked at each other, clearly disturbed. Círdan was still anonymous. However, Mershon had concluded correctly that a facility existed in the Atlantic which enslaved Muggles. Needless to say, he'd inform the president, who would want to send in the Coast Guard. The president would likely order Radner to take the base out, possibly with a nuke. Mershon excused himself and raced into the command center. Ariadne reached into her pocket for her wand to stop him, and her fingers closed on empty air. It took her a second to realize that she had thrown the wand to the floor to calm the refugees. By the time she had retrieved it, Mershon was gone. It was only a matter of time. American forces were almost certainly going to Círdan on an emancipation expedition. The fact that Voldemort wasn't there was irrelevant, for all the Muggles knew. The Ciudadani aristocracy consisted entirely of Death Eaters. This was going to be a problem, she thought. Voldemort's actions may have just indirectly triggered a war between the United States and Círdan, outskirts of Rattle city-state of Rattle, Indian Ocean, east of Seychelles. The rays of the midday sun, filtered by water, were mixed with the kaleidoscope of hundreds of magical light sources, illuminating almost every corner of the city to a level equal to broad daylight on the surface. Jarno, envoy of the Lake Hogsmeade town, could clearly see why Rattle was called the Shining City. The young Selkie spent his third day in the city and still couldn't help but feel lost in its vastness. His hometown had 2,000 inhabitants, and neighboring tribes weren't bigger either. He has known all of them by face, if not by name. Rattle, on the other hand, even when he swam up to the surface, he couldn't see the end of that mass of towering spires and domes. He heard the city had over 100,000 citizens, and that was just the merpeople with a house in the town, not counting the crowds of ever-present merchants and the tens of thousands of air-breather guests. It was a magnificent place, with numerous undercurrents, great houses, minor houses, guilds, commoners, air-breathers. His home waters had a saying: when in Rattle, keep your eyes wide open, your mouth shut close, and your hands near your dagger and your purse. This day, he decided to look around on one of the local markets before the council's evening session, hoping to buy some of the fabled magical products, or at least some souvenirs. His hosts had given him enough instructions to find the market, and as he checked again and again, his money was still with him. Unknown to him, he was as safe as he ever were. The identification armband he received in the greater council chamber had deterred any pickpockets and other criminals. It was common knowledge in the city that harming foreign diplomats in any way is bad for business, as it inevitably provokes investigations and raids from the guards. Red Squad moved towards the marketplace at a leisurely pace, carrying the shark carcasses skewered on poles. Tony and one of his squad mates, a smallish Mero-Selkie hybrid female, were carrying one of the smaller ones, right behind the four guys bearing the 5 meters long tiger shark. For Red 2, life was good. Symbolizing full squad membership, a necklace of freshly harvested tiger shark teeth hung from his neck, a good night's. The girl's exotic beauty was alluring, that much all squad members agreed on, but Tony found himself thinking that some things about her just didn't add up. A delicate woman like her, choosing an openly violent job instead of partaking in the subtle intrigues of house politics. For all he heard, she's been in the squad for years, and proved over and over again that she is more than bright enough to earn a high place in some house, or in the city guards if she liked theoretically, politically neutral brain work like being a detective. Border defense was an unusual choice for women. It was a place for hardened mermen who loved the thrill of hunt and battle, or ambitious youths like him who wanted to prove they have the balls before climbing higher in society. And sometimes, for merpersons whose superiors wanted them out of the way. He never heard anyone talking about her past before Red Squad, so could she be one of those? Had he been a little more insightful, he'd have thought about why an attractive woman nearing 30 is without a husband, boyfriend, or lover. The week-long shifts didn't stop other squad members from having relationships. Had he been a little more observant, he'd have noticed that all other members of Red Squad, Kima included, were currently ogling a pair of siren ladies wearing elaborate tattoos which accentuated the curves of their body. Chapter 259. Clinton finds out about Círdan. Tuesday, July 2, 1996, Oval Office, White House, Washington, DEC, United States of America. Next Pav. 260, Dagher Travis Radner hurried into the Oval Office. Clinton wanted to speak with him, and judging from Ariadne's latest report, the wizard was fairly certain as to what the conversation would be about. The Secretary of Magic had been intrigued by Two Bears' recommendation that all 7 regional offices of the Department of Magic adopt at least one Muggle instructor in their wizarding school, preferably to teach Muggle studies. So far, only 2 of these positions had been filled. Isaac Sanders in Fourth Mesa and Claire Cox was in Big Thicket. He made a mental note to ask Ken Franco to get a few of the Muggles from Miami to stay behind in the Ocala facility after the city had been cleaned up. Radnor's first thought was to send David Stern to MT St. Helens, along with significant financial compensation for the obliviation. The secretary recognized the name from before the Super Bowl breach, when Strong Bear was busy trying to chase down the Blast Cola employees who had filmed Harry Potter in London. Strong Bear had explained that Stern had been more than willing to help contain the breach before it had taken place, and that it had been a mistake to obliviate him during the panic immediately after the commercial had been aired in the stadium. He had no idea if Stern would be willing to move up north. Then again, with the economy about to tank because of the partial destruction of New York and London, people would probably travel anywhere to get a job. It occurred to Radnor that Stern might not have to move at all. Sanders's house was already connected to the Flu network, so he could go to Fourth Mesa. All American fireplaces were linked to the network, which meant that all Stern had to do was head over to Sanders's house, maybe a 45-minute commute, and hop into the fireplace. It was something to think about. And it was far less important than the discussion he was about to have with the president. Clinton shook Radnor's hand and bid him be seated. There was the obligatory small talk for a couple of minutes, and then the grilling began. "Mr. Radnor, I've just received a rather unusual note from the man in charge of the Coast Guard. It appears that our old friend Voldemort has established a secret base in the middle of the Atlantic, hidden it from Muggle eyes, and had his Death Eaters enslave and torture the Muggles. Had it not been for those 3 refugees and the fact that someone in Enfield spoke their language, we would never have known. What are we going to do about that?" Radnor hesitated for a moment. Although he wasn't particularly fond of what Círdan did to its Muggles, they were certainly not Death Eaters. They weren't inherently evil as much as misguided. From the little he knew of that nation's culture, a good 15–20% of the wizards didn't have slaves at all, and another 25% didn't force them into squalid conditions. Abolitionist movements even crept up from time to time, but trying to wean Círdan off of slavery was about as effective as trying to wean the Muggle world off of oil. He had to be very careful here, as he had no choice but to reveal Círdan's existence at this point. Thankfully, his audience would be someone who would be able to classify this information as top secret and not let it spread further. The country would go bonkers if it discovered that wizards were enslaving people a couple of time zones away. Bracing himself, he began to explain. "Mr. President, we're familiar with the location in the Atlantic the Coast Guard is referring to. Rest assured, sir, the refugees did not escape from a Death Eater base." He paused for a moment. "Sir, I request that what I'm about to tell you be classified." Clinton nodded. "Fine with me. What is it?" "Sir, they are from the hidden state of Círdan." Clinton's eyes widened. "State of what? Isn't that their last name?" "Their last name is actually Senaltry. Sir, Círdan is an island which lies in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, on an exposed portion of the mid-Atlantic ridge in the tropics. The reason you have never heard of it is because it is invisible to Muggles. The statute of secrecy necessitated its removal, at the time, as it is a wizarding stronghold. Invisible to Muggles. You've got invisible islands out there." "Yes, sir. You already know about Atlantis, after all. This one is similar." "Jesus Christ, Radnor. How many of these places do you guys have?" Radnor shook his head. "I can't tell you, sir. If others do exist, I would not be permitted to reveal them to Muggles without their explicit permission. It would be a serious diplomatic faux pas. They'd have hidden themselves for a reason, after all. The only reason I'm bringing Círdan up is because we may have to start interacting with them." "I see. What can you tell me about this place?" "It's a feudal society, sir. It's been isolated from the Muggle world for a while, so its culture has stagnated. It consists of about 10,000 wizards and 140,000 Muggles. The capital is Círdash, and it has 50,000 people. The wizards are the upper class, and the Muggles comprise the peasantry. It's ruled by an executive committee of 3 chancellors which rotate on a 3-month basis and serves for 3 years. Geologically, Círdan is a lot like Iceland, with lots of geysers. Clinton frowned. Let me guess. Those 3 refugees we picked up were people who didn't like their master and tried to escape during the chaos of Judgment Day. The man with that symbol on his robe we dragged out of the Atlantic was their master, who had tried to sneak into the country to take them back. Radner nodded. That's correct, sir. The reason they panicked when they saw Ariadne and Perman was because they thought that they'd been caught by Círdan wizards and were about to be sent back to their master. Clinton whistled. This reminds me a lot of the antebellum South, where all the slaves were trying to escape to the north. Radner didn't want to admit it, but he had to. It's something like that, sir, complete with all of the debate as to what to do with fugitive slaves captured in the north. Clinton hesitated for a moment. I suspect that these Círdan are going to want these people back. That is likely, sir. Do they want to go back? No, sir. Absolutely not. They risked their lives to get away from the island after all. Clinton folded his arms across his chest. Well, they're American citizens now, and we'll protect them. To be honest, I find it a bit disturbing that serfdom still exists, especially with Muggles being enslaved by wizards. If America for Humans finds out about this, or surviving Death Eaters, for that matter they'll go berserk. Speaking of Death Eaters, are there any on this island? Is it in fact ruled by Death Eaters who are taking advantage of the feudal society to rule Muggles? Radner shook his head. I would expect not. Sir Círdan's style of government may be backwards, but feudalism is not intrinsically evil. That's good to hear. Is there anything we can do to help the people of Círdan? I must admit, as an American leader, I find the idea of people being forced into serfdom because they're Muggles a bit, well, disturbing. I'm not sure if there's much we can do, sir. They're a sovereign nation, albeit a strange one. Trying to remove serfdom from their culture is trying to remove democracy from ours. It will take a long time. Remember that this peculiarity is more cultural than anything else. How about a special ops team? I must say, embarking on an expedition to free Muggles from serfdom would look good during an election year. Radner rolled his eyes. Not if it fails, sir, and I'd expect the survivors in Ogdensburg, New York, and Miami would beg to differ. Besides, what exactly would they do? They can't go in without wizards, and in all fairness, they would likely be placed into servitude with the other Muggles. You've also got 10,000 wizards on that island. That's more than Voldemort's entire army of Death Eaters. You'd need a full invasion force against a magical opponent which knows the terrain, and with the economy in a freefall, we can't risk another war. Can we try to reform them from the inside? Support the abolitionist groups, perhaps? Possibly, but I doubt it would succeed. It would be like trying to switch the United States over to communism by supporting the American Communist Party. Think of these guys like the wizarding version of North Korea, well, before North Korea fell to Voldemort. Clinton stood and looked out the window. I still feel obliged to act here. It just feels right. We can't just stand by in a situation like this. Am I correct in assuming that these Círdan probably know we're aware of their existence now? They tried to come over here and get the refugees, after all. Radner bit his lip. I would agree with that. We don't know for certain, but we should at least consider that as a possibility. Clinton turned and faced Radner. His face was grim. Then we have to act now, before they can do something to make it harder to free the serfs. We need to act before they get organized. Radner drew a deep breath. Sir, this would be an unprovoked attack. Círdan has not done anything to the United States. They tried to abduct 3 of our citizens, and for all we know that rogue wave the oil tanker encountered was a Círdan attack. That wave killed 4 crewmen. Radner shook his head. You don't know that the wave was a Círdan attack, and at present all 3 refugees are still safe in Boston. Clinton thought for a moment, then nodded abruptly. Send a message to Círdan. Tell them we'll compensate them for the loss of their serfs in gold. Obliviate Mershan and anyone else who knows of those 3 people's background. Finally, get them to learn English so they can blend in with society better. This should serve as a good diplomatic first step. Meanwhile, we can think about trying to save those poor Muggles from serfdom. Radner nodded. It was indeed a good first step, but what happened if the president changed his mind a few months later? Or, worse still, someone from Nestor found out and decided to ally with the United States against Círdan. If Clinton were given enough wizards to make an invasion of Círdan an option. The Secretary of Magic shuddered. Rumor had it that Clinton liked younger women and that he was having an affair with one of his interns. If some Amazon from Nestor walked into his office, Market District of Rakta City State of Rakta, Indian Ocean, east of Seychelles, the butcher's storeroom was almost proven too crowded for Red Squad, but after some jostling, they all fit in. In the middle, there was a massive table with the equally massive tiger shark on it. The smaller ones were already gutted, skinned, and put on hooks near the walls, with their entrails packed out, searched, and catalogued with nothing extraordinary so far. Famed as the ocean's dustbin, the tiger shark was left to the end, so the butcher's men could take the others out to the shop's counter fast. The shop's owner, a burly siren with a bald head, took a look at the beast's mouth. I see he has no teeth left, so who did you guys initiate this time? That would be Tony right here. He teared its gills apart too. I see that. It's either a masterful or a very lucky cut. Son, it alone would have killed the bastard. You know, it's tradition that you get to search your first on-duty kill and keep anything you find inside, he said as he passed a huge dagger to the rookie. Tony took it in his hand, measured its shape and weight distribution, and when he was satisfied with his grip, he plunged it in the shark's underside near its tail and pulled it all the way to its neck. Swimming above to have a good look at the slit, he noticed something glinting in the shark's guts. Plunging his hand in, he felt metal and pulled only to let go with a startled yelp when it was revealed to be an ornate ring still on a severed, half-digested hand. For a minute, everyone in the room froze. Hardened men looked away and struggled to keep their lunch down. Kima was the first to speak, and although her voice was a bit shaky and her complexion a lot greener than usual, she sounded like she knows exactly what to do. Everybody, keep your calm. Butcher, please stop the water filtering immediately and leave the room. Make sure no one comes in unless it's the guards. Squad, leave everything where it is and go call the city guards. Tell them we have a possible murder victim. And Red 2, leave your necklace here. As of now, it's considered evidence in a criminal investigation. Speaking of it, you picked up the thing. Sarp says you'll be quarantined, so do everyone a favor and stay here without touching anyone. The stunned merman did exactly as she said, and hastily swam away, leaving only 2 merpersons in the room, pondering how big a crap they got into on their leaves of all times. The silence was only broken by Tony's desperate question. Even if I lose that necklace, I'm still full squad member, right? Right. Chapter 260. Psychological screening is not enough. Wednesday, July 3, 1996, Atlantis Hadar Dagher was now Grand Mugwump, and he didn't have the foggiest notion where to begin. He didn't think he was qualified for the position, and he was still relatively young, in his late 50s. He understood why Dialanis had chosen him. Elevating Endukaku would have put the astrologer's key in the hands of Rasho Slank, who, until recently, had been a mid-level astrologer and not particularly qualified for controlling the key. Dumbledore, the prior Grand Mugwump, was now British Minister of Magic and probably had his hands full cleaning up after London. Radner would have been a good candidate as well, except that his country had been hit with 3 nukes and was about to fall into a depression. Guess who that left? He had to admit, though, that his promotion to Grand Mugwump would gain him a lot more public exposure, which could benefit the world in another way. He was a devout Muslim, and his faith had developed a bad reputation due to the heinous acts of Muslims for humans, the Hamas militants, and Al-Qaeda. All three groups claimed that they operated in the name of Allah, whereas in practice, he condemned virtually all of their actions. It was about time someone showed the world what a true Muslim was like, with all the good deeds, charity, and dedication to the community. He found the idea of unifying the monotheistic faiths intriguing. Whether Christianity was still considered monotheistic was debatable, what with the Trinity, and all but Judaism certainly was. He had to admit that if Samuel, who hadn't been seen for a long time, Suleiman I, and John Paul could pull it off, it would be a big step to eliminating religious warfare on the planet. He personally doubted that this initiative would succeed. Then again, Allah worked in mysterious ways. He had read through the most recent reports before heading into the briefing room for the latest press conference. Saddam Hussein was attracting Muslim wizards all over the world. Dagher was worried that the Iraqi leader was taking advantage of his participation in Judgment Day to try to bolster his own country's power. Granted, Mubarak had got the Habibite triangle out of the deal, but Saddam was a much more unstable man. No one really knew what was going to happen with him. The fact that he had nearly refused to participate in Judgment Day without getting Kuwait out of the deal chilled Dagher to the core, and Dagher didn't want to think about what would have happened had Saddam managed to defy Demir. Over 500,000 Muggles were now entered in the lottery to move to Atlantis. They came from all over the world. Oddly enough, a good 150 came from the Ukraine, and most of them were devotees of the Black God. He found that a bit odd, but he figured that they were probably being discriminated against in their homeland, wanted to find a place where they would be able to practice their faith safely. None of them seemed to be particularly dangerous, and the background checks reported that they had no prior criminal record or link to terrorist groups or known evil wizards. Something about Russia and the Ukraine didn't make sense, however. The Romanovs were convinced that Judgment Day had started the 6-year countdown towards their extermination, assuming they had interpreted Kurchatova's prophecy correctly. Endukaku claimed the greatest portion of the threat to civilization, now steady at 1.8%, came from the Ukraine. The only thing he could think of was a coup or series of assassinations in Russia of the various Romanovs, leading to instability in that country. There was one other possibility as well, but it was so remote as to be relegated to the back burner for a while. The Romanovs seemed to believe that Grigory Rasputin had possessed a Horcrux and had been revived earlier in the year. There had been a whole series of strange events involving Rasputin, including a fight over his father's grave. The problem with this theory was that from Dagher knew about history, Rasputin seemed to like hobnobbing with the rich and powerful. One would have expected him to have announced himself, or at least made an appearance in public, before now. Yet neither of those events had taken place, and Tsar Alexei himself was starting to wonder if he had overreacted to the theft of the Mad Monk's music box a few months ago. Pushing Rasputin out of his mind, he made his way to the podium with the necklace containing the Atlantis key around his neck. Cameras flashed as he introduced himself and explained his background. Eventually, he got to the point. Looking into the crowd, he made his important announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, it has come to Atlantis' attention that most of the World for Humans organizations are willing to cease their terrorist acts if the wizarding community learns to police itself. They realize now that magic can be used for good as well as for evil. It is nothing but a tool, after all. With this in mind, it is my duty to announce that beginning with 1997-1998 school year, all wizarding schools will be required to administer psychological examinations to all applicants. These will be designed to ensure that future generations of witches and wizards will not only be skilled at magic, but have the maturity and integrity to use it wisely. Applicants who fail these examinations will not be admitted. I believe that such a test would have caught Voldemort as a child. As my esteemed colleague Albus Dumbledore has explained, the young Tom Riddle had stolen other children's toys at his orphanage and enjoyed using his power to intimidate people. Decent people don't do such things, and the test we have in mind would have failed Voldemort as soon as that information came to light. Dagger looked into the crowd. Rest assured, ladies and gentlemen, there will be no more Voldemorts ever again. Britain for Humans headquarters. Isabel Miller couldn't believe that the America for Humans Executive Committee had fallen for it. Sure, preventing people like Voldemort from attending wizarding schools would be a very good first step. However, what was there to prevent an evil wizard's parents from teaching him or her magic outside of school? What was Dagger going to do to address the possibility that there were other adult evil wizards hiding out there, biding their time until the furor over Voldemort had died down and Atlantis had relaxed its defenses? She walked to the microphone and made the point clearly and concisely. She explained that although she appreciated Dagger's gesture, it wouldn't be enough. Britain for Humans demanded unbreakable vows, and nothing else would suffice. Revelation, party headquarters. Judith Rogers was barely able to keep up with processing the new applicants. They agreed with her that Dagger's concession wasn't nearly enough. Sure, it would probably help ensure responsible use of magic in the year 2010. However, that wouldn't do much good if the world blew itself up between now and then. Chapter 261, Geminio Dollar Bill. Wednesday, July 3, 1996. Macon, Georgia. Brian Huckabee looked at the dollar bill and memorized the serial number. K28,667,621. Hoping that this trick would work, he flattened out all of the creases and put it into the vending machine. The mechanism whirred and sucked the bill in. Less than a second later, the little display over the bill entry slot changed to show that he had deposited a credit of $1. That was all he needed to know. Knowing that there weren't any problems with the bill after all, he'd gotten it as change from lunch at a Muggle rest stop a few hours earlier. He put it back in his pocket and opened his wallet. He rummaged around among the bills until he found the one he wanted. It, too, had the serial number K28,667,621. It looked very similar to the bill Huckabee had inserted into the vending machine. He could see a couple of imperfections here and there, but those would almost certainly be overlooked as spots of dirt or ink. He stepped back up to the machine and inserted the second bill into the slot. Once again, the display reported that he had deposited $1. Well, he thought. The United States was very good at detecting counterfeit currency. It was a pity that they had never considered the possibility that wizards would attempt to duplicate bills using the Geminio spell. All of those years, living under the statute of secrecy, were going to come in handy. Grinning, he pushed E5 on the display, and the bottle of Diet Coke tumbled into the dispenser at the bottom of the machine. It appeared that the 5% pay cut he had taken at his Muggle job as a factory foreman wasn't going to have as much of an impact on his life as he had feared. Cortex Medical Technologies, Mayfield Heights, Ohio. Mary Stone looked at the rest of the people on the executive board. I don't have any idea what Harold Green has done, either. First they claim that they have no money, and now all of a sudden they're spending money as if there's no tomorrow. The president frowned. Have they done anything strange of late? Have they introduced any new products? Not that I know of, Mr. Fernwell. However, I can't rule that out. They've recently acquired a large amount of lead, presumably to test antidotes to lead poisoning or something like that. Perhaps they're on the verge of patenting a medical breakthrough in this field. Fernwell shook his head. That doesn't make sense, Mary. How could they be selling something which no one knows exists? Mary shrugged. I don't know, sir. Fernwell thought for a moment. Maybe we can figure out what they're working on and see if we can get in on the action. Rebecca, You've got a bunch of contacts over there. Have they made any other unusual purchases? Rebecca Harrison nodded. Believe it or not, they have. They've placed an order for a few dozen flasks of mercury with a special note to focus on distilling it so that only the lightest isotopes are there. Furthermore, they've picked up a large number of radiation suits. Fernwell gaped at her. Radiation suits? What the hell would they be doing with radiation suits? Mary shrugged. Perhaps they're trying to think of a cure for radiation poisoning as part of this experimental project. After all, Sirius Black, the man who killed Voldemort, succumbed to radiation poisoning when we attacked Pyongyang. He won't be the first, I'm afraid. Fernwell grunted. I don't buy it, but I can't think of a better idea. Now, what about the mercury? Why would they only want the lightest isotopes? Those are pretty rare, if I remember correctly. Not sure, sir. I'm not big on nuclear chemistry. But won't all isotopes act the same way? In theory, yes. However, melting and boiling points can change slightly from isotope to isotope. The differences are minor, but they're there. Mary shook her head. I doubt the differences are enough to warrant all of the extra work necessary to separate out the lightest isotopes. Either that, or there's some kind of bizarre physical property they've discovered which only applies to the lightest isotopes. Rebecca, have they issued any other press releases, since the one where they said they were going to buy all that lead? Rebecca nodded. Yup. They've announced that they're looking into becoming a supplier of hydrogen, deuterium, and tritium for medical purposes. This came out shortly after my contacts claimed they purchased the flasks of mercury. There are rumors they've found a supply of lithium as well, but not as much of it. Fernwell whistled. Tritium. I must say, that explains the radiation suits. It sure sounds like they're trying to make some kind of supercure which will handle various types of poisoning, radiation, lead, and mercury. Can you think of any other explanations? No one could, which was disturbing. One drug which would handle all types of poisoning would be an extremely valuable commodity. Fernwell grunted. They're taking a major risk here, spending money like there's no tomorrow just as the economy is falling into a recession. They must be pretty confident that this is going to work. We need to get involved here, I'd say. Maybe we can cash in on this. Rebecca chuckled. Speaking of cashing in, I'd recommend that we buy into whatever gold mine or magical spell those characters invoke to get all that money. Suddenly her jaw dropped. Magical spell. She hesitated, then finally spoke. Good God, did they hire a wizard? That would explain a lot of stuff. Fernwell nodded. I agree. We should look into getting one as well. Parametric Technology Corporation. I looked at Matt Ender in horror. I don't like this, Matt. I really don't. Matt rolled his eyes. A 10% pay cut is a hell of a lot better than being laid off, wouldn't you say? If it makes you feel any better, the entire company is going to be taking the same cut. Hopefully, we'll be able to reinstate it when the economy turns around. I thought about it for a second and realized that it could have been a hell of a lot worse. I was only a few months out of graduate school, and $44,000 a year seemed like a ridiculously high salary to me. Furthermore, I was still accustomed to living like a graduate student, so I could just revert back to that. I did know one thing for certain, though. It didn't look like I'd be moving out of Waltham any time soon, and if I did, I would probably be forced to get a roommate. Little did I know that in an alternate timeline where the Super Bowl breach did not occur, I would have already started looking for new apartments, eventually moving to Brookline in 1997. For the first time since the Blast Cola commercial had first been aired, the Super Bowl breach had caused a major structural change in my Life City Guards HQ, Rock to Rattle City State of Rock to Rattle, Indian Ocean, east of Seychelles. The members of Red Squad waited excitedly for the briefing to begin. Hunting intruders, mundane ones more often than not, was fun for them, but it got repetitive after a time. Also, Tony has passed all examinations just fine, and was allowed out of quarantine back to them, which improved team morale. Their general consensus was that being involved in some mystery puzzle was a refreshing change for once, and being the ones to kill and open the shock in which the hand and the ring was found, involved they were. The city guards present in the room were less enthusiastic. They were professional detectives and investigators. For them, this was just everyday work. Nonetheless, they still stood at attention and forced a mix of discipline and interest onto their faces when their chief swam in the room and took his place at the podium. At ease, ladies and gentlemen. We have a weird case on our hands, but I'm confident you can handle and solve it as professionals. Now, on to the case. The coroner's report about the hand says it most likely belonged to an adult human male, estimated age 30-40, red body hair, pale white skin with mild sunburns. Finely manicured nails and overall good skin condition indicate higher class with little or no manual labor. But there are some old scars, mostly heat trauma at the back of the hand. It had been severed from the body by an extremely sharp tool which cut clean through it, making it relatively painless for the victim, who was definitely alive at that time, about 2.5 days before now. We found 2 pieces of evidence with the hand, a piece of clothing and a ring. The clothing is the sleeve of a dark brown cotton robe, cut between the wrist and the elbow with something very sharp in one motion, which is consistent with the wound on the hand. It is unmarked, unlike the ring. I have to say, it's a really garish piece of bling. It's apparently 24-karat gold with a yellow gemstone, probably topaz, but given that it's inscribed with runes and its magical eye wouldn't be 100% sure of its composition. A resident magic analyst says it has at least half a dozen enchantments on it. So far he identified some sort of luck charm, and at least 4 things I won't even try to pronounce, but are passive defenses against heat, kinetic effects, cutting magic, and enchantment cancelling. My thoughts are that our victim is, or was, a wizard. The attack could have occurred anywhere within a day as the shark swims, but given that it was found in a shark, it happened outside the city, so it falls under border defense jurisdiction, and knowing your boss, he'll say whoever found it takes the case. Hey, Kima, look at that. Guess I was wrong when I said you'll never again do any detective work. Have fun finding out what happened here. With these final words, the chief smirked smugly at the amused hybrid, dismissed. Meanwhile, somewhere in Raktarattle, the room had no door and no window, and almost no furniture either. The only source of light was an enchanted gemstone on the table in the corner, its usually bright light toned down. It faintly illuminated a chest, a bed in the other side of the room, and the shadowy, human-sized individual in baggy clothing sitting on it with his head resting in his left hand. There was a loud crack, and a smaller figure appeared. It bowed towards the bigger person, kneeled before it, and gave something in its left hand, then began to speak in a piping voice. Master, Floppy has found Master's wand in the ocean, but there is no trace of the ring even after 2 days of search. Floppy has failed Master, bad Floppy, bad, bad. The house elf, because she was one of those, started to bang her head on the rock floor near her master's feet. Enough, my servant, you've done well. You need not punish yourself. For with wand in my hand again, I'll retake what's rightfully mine, and have my vengeance on those backstabbing vermin. Chapter 262. Real Life, I said. Wednesday, July 3, 1996, Sanders Residenza Prescott, Arizona, United States of America. Next Pav. 263, Megan Baldwin. Isaac Sanders nearly dropped the book in shock. He had never thought that something out of a fantasy novel could actually apply to real life. Then again, no one had expected that stories about magic or wizards would apply to real life either. He had always been a big fan of Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time series. Set thousands of years and 2 ages from the series' perspective in the future, most of the action took place in a world which was familiar with magic and had several organizations and protocols in place which were intended to cater to working with wizards. Several thousand years before the main plot line commenced, human civilization had combined magic and advanced technology to create a flourishing, almost utopian civilization. All of that was undone, however, when an evil guard found a way to interfere with the world and plunge the utopia into war. Although humanity was eventually able to seal the guard back in his prison, the guard's counterstroke drove all male spellcasters, known as Aes Sedai in the series, mad. The uncontrolled misuse of magic triggered a cataclysm which destroyed civilization and restricted magic use only to women. Jordan went on to explain that shortly after the cataclysm, the Muggles, so to speak, refused to trust the surviving spellcasters given what had happened last time they had tried to use their power. This forced the surviving organizations of female Aes Sedai to adopt the three oaths, three unbreakable vows each candidate had to accept in order to be accepted into the magical community. Satisfied that the witches would be able to control their behavior through the oaths, the Muggles began to trust the Aes Sedai once more, and the two groups started to work together to help rebuild a shattered world. Sanders could not help but think that the world's current situation was very similar to that which the characters in Jordan's series had faced after the cataclysm. In both cases, magic had been used irresponsibly on a large scale, causing terrible destruction and causing the Muggles to distrust the wizards. Furthermore, the vast majority of the spellcasters who survived the cataclysms, the breaking of the world in the Jordan series and Judgment Day in real life, were good people and would be great assets in dealing with the changed world. America, for humans, had argued that they would only trust the wizards if they agreed to police themselves. Muslims, for humans, agreed with America, for humans. They would also put down their weapons and cease all terrorist activity if the wizards behaved. Britain, for humans, was thinking along the same lines as well. However, they argued that unbreakable vows would be necessary to keep the current crop of wizards in line, and that psychological screening would be introduced to prevent future Voldemorts. People had been wondering how exactly the wizards would deal with this situation. Strong Bear himself had told him that the wizards were divided about this, and Atlantis was still too busy cleaning up the mess from Judgment Day to give it much thought at the international level. Sanders looked at the book on the floor. Could Robert Jordan have solved their problem for them? At the very least, could Jordan's solution appease the various anti-wizard factions long enough to find a permanent solution? He knew that it was possible for wizards to force unbreakable vows upon people, as easily as the oath rod forced them upon people in the Jordan series. He rummaged through the Wheel of Time books until he came across the exact texts of the three oaths which each Aes Sedai apprentice, accepted in the Jordan lexicon, would be forced to swear when she graduated the White Tower, the main wizarding school in the series. Under the light, and by my hope of salvation and rebirth, I vow that I will speak no word that is not true. Sanders doubted that this would work. Unlike in the fantasy series, wizards would die if they violated an unbreakable vow. Furthermore, there could be cases where a wizard would be forced to lie to save lives. This seemed too strict, and the punishment was too severe for the crime. Under the light, and by my hope of salvation and rebirth, I vow that I will make no weapon for one man to kill another. Sanders whistled when he thought about that. Nuclear weapons transmitted as portkeys certainly counted as weapons with magical support. Had this vow been in place, 1,000,000 lives could have been spared, and Judgment Day would have likely been averted. Under the light, and by my hope of salvation and rebirth, I vow that I will never use the one power as a weapon except against Shadowspawn, or in the last extreme of defending my life, or that of my warder or another sister. The third Aes Sedai oath basically amounted to a promise to restrict military use of magic to self-defense or defense of an ally, and in that case, only as an absolute last resort. This oath, which would be waived for fighting dark wizards and evil creatures, combined with the second oath to make it virtually impossible to wield magic as a weapon, either directly or indirectly. Sanders smiled. He suddenly had a vision of wizards taking various AES Sedai like unbreakable vows and being given the honorific Sedai, for instance, strong bear Sedai or Dialinus Sedai to show the world they were trusted. Although he suspected that the vows would first start out as optional, it would only be a matter of time until all of the wizards took them. After all, if you had a choice between a wizard who had taken the unbreakable vows and one who hadn't, whom would you want to do business with? He thought about how well the 3 oaths worked in the books. The primary problem with the oaths was that there was no oath preventing an Aes Sedai from renouncing an oath. This allowed several characters in the story to become Black Adger, Jordan's equivalent of a dark witch. He'd have to plug that hole if he wanted to make a truly useful set of vows. He scribbled on a piece of paper for a few moments. When he was done, the paper read as follows: I vow that I will make no weapon for one sentient being to harm another, either physically, mentally, or emotionally. I vow that I will never use magic as a weapon except against dark creatures, dark wizards, or in the last extreme of defending my life or that of another sentient being. I vow that I will obey the laws of the land and its head of state justly and impartially, unless the laws require me to violate one of the other 4 vows. I vow to do my utmost to ensure that the custom of taking these 5 vows is transmitted to the next generation of witches and wizards. I vow that I will not renounce any of these 5 vows. Sanders put down the pen and looked at what he had written. It was 5 vows, and not 3, but he doubted that would matter. It was a start, and it would offer the wizarding world a way out of its current predicament. He nodded, thrust the paper into his pocket, and headed over to the fireplace. Seconds later, he was in transit to Fourth Mesa with an idea which could eventually change the world. Chapter 263, Wizard Rock Concert. Wednesday, July 3, 1996, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, Great Britain. From E. Megan Baldwin, Notrin at Hogwarts, UK to Rec Music Ethnic, Alt, Fan, Wizards, Hermione at Granger Dental, Calm, Hermione at Hogwarts, UK, and Baldwin at Oxford, EduSubject, Wizard Rock Concert 7-7. Hello, Usenet. I've just wanted to tell you about a very cool event which is about to take place in 4 days at Manchester United's football stadium. The Wizarding Rock Band, known as the Weird Sisters, is going to be throwing a free benefit concert for the people affected by the Judgment Day attacks. Although admission is free, the band members will be accepting contributions for the United Nations Fund, which has been set up to help the victims of the nuclear attacks. Yes, you read that right. A wizard rock band. It appears that the wizards have picked up enough of our culture over the years to realize that we like rock and have graduated from Gregorian chants and church music over the past few hundred years. Hermione Granger, you probably recognize the name, had some of her friends here at Hogwarts capture footage of the band's concert at Hogwarts for New Year's 1995. Albus Dumbledore, our Minister of Magic, who was headmaster at the time, hosted a major international magical tournament at the school during the 1994-1995 school year, and the Weird Sisters were more than happy to come for this special occasion. Hermione herself was unable to pay much attention to the music at the time because she found herself spending most of her time snogging the late Quidditch player and tournament participant, Victor Crumb, whom she had a bit of a crush on. However, her classmates at Hogwarts did and were hooked. Hermione became interested as well when she listened to the concert after the ball had concluded. Hermione played me some of the footage from the concert. These guys are cool. Despite their name, they're all men in their early 20s. They're all wizards, and I think several of them are gorgeous. They seem to focus on heavy metal and can put on a really good show. Best of all, they actually use magic and ride unusual animals in their show. Sometimes they fly through the air and ride hippogriffs, weird animals, which are sort of like a cross between a bird and a horse. You really should go see these guys. If you like wizards music and want to learn about wizard and other unusual cultures, head on over to that football stadium. You're not going to regret it. I promise you. Hermione is already planning on going if her schedule permits. Her two friends, Ron Weasley and Harry Potter, will also in attendance. In case you recognize Harry's name, he's the kid who destroyed Voldemort's last Horcrux and was caught flying his broom in the Blast Cola commercial. If you're lucky, you'll be able to meet him as well. We may be in for yet another surprise. There are rumors that King William himself may be attending this benefit concert. Supposedly, he's been talking with Hermione. I think he has the hots for her, and she showed him the footage. He seems to like this group as well. If you want to meet the king, now's your chance. It may be remote, and he may be surrounded by people like Dumbledore and Tarzan, but who knows? Maybe Hermione has something up her sleeve. P.S. Yes, we have a computer here at Hogwarts. We got one as a gift shortly after the Super Bowl breach. Hermione taught Dumbledore, who was still headmaster, to use it. Someone apparently broke it shortly after it arrived, but the government eventually shipped over another one, and the new one is still working. It looks like I've got our potions master, Horace Slughorn, hooked on a few of the games. Megan Baldwin, don't call me Aaron. Oxford University Anthropology Department candidate, hopefully by 2000 hometown. Doolin, Ireland Embaldwin at Oxford. Edu == from Hermione Granger, Hermione at Granger Dental, to Rec Music Ethnic, Alt, Fan, Wizards, Notrin at Hogwarts, UK, Baldwin at Oxford, EduSubject. Ray, Wizard Rock Concert 7-7. Hello, this is Hermione. I'd like to follow up on Professor Baldwin's post with my own view of the band. I think she's hit the nail right on the head. I was raised as a Muggle, and I was blown away by what I saw. Trust me, people, you're going to like these guys. Sincerely. Hermione Granger P.S. Yes, the king's coming. And no, I did not spend all my time snogging Victor Crumb, who, I might add, died a hero's death fighting in Korea. Ciudadani Council Chamber. Ortilu stared at Travis Radner. You're telling us he wants to keep our yahoos and repay us with gold. Radner nodded. Yes, Madame Chancellor. The yahoos have asked for asylum in the United States, and the Muggle president has granted it. Vixar growled. We own them. They can't do that without permission. Radner shook his head. Unfortunately, sir, the Muggles don't see it that way. They are assuming the yahoos are refugees, and that, as such, they are entitled to refugee status. And judging from the fact they escaped Noah Raft, you can't blame them. I'm sorry, but this is a Muggle government you're dealing with, and one which doesn't endorse slavery. Believe me, sir, this is probably the best deal you will be able to get without exposing your existence to the Muggles. Sayatnan put her hand on her chin. You didn't expose us. We're very grateful, Mr. Radner. Radner nodded. That is correct. The only person who knows about you for certain is the president, and he has ordered the information classified. The people who interacted with them on the oil tanker have been obliviated. All three chancellors breathed a sigh of relief, at which point Ortilu said, Phew, that was close. All we have to do now is bring back Altry, and this issue will be closed. Radner bit his lip. Altry, unfortunately, is dead. He was caught trying to break into the country illegally to smuggle the slaves out. I'm sorry, chancellors. Sayatnan stared at him in shock. You executed him for trying to get his property back. He crashed into the Portkey barrier, madame. It was his own fault. Next time you want to visit, ask for permission and don't use Portkeys. Vixar grunted. Good riddance, from what I've been told. He was an absolute jerk, and he abused the yahoos a great deal. Send the gold bullion over to his widow. I don't think he'll need any slaves at the moment. He seems to have a full complement, and he's got a pretty small planation at that. Sayatnan shook her head. I wouldn't be so sure. The 4 new slaves he picked up can't speak a word of Ciudadani. I wonder where he got them. They're not Vila, Xyland, Dalernic, or from anywhere in the Gulliver consortium. Radner suddenly had an awful suspicion. He had to be diplomatic about this. Keep an eye on him and make sure he doesn't abuse these new ones. When did he get them? Ortilu shrugged. A few days ago. Why? Radner closed his eyes. I hope he didn't take them off the oil tanker. If so, I may be ordered to investigate, and that may not be pretty. Chapter 264, Presidential Debate. Wednesday, July 3, 1996, Independence Hall, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, United States of America. Bill Clinton had nearly fallen over when he realized the implications of what Radner had told him. There may have been a very good explanation for the disappearance of the 4 oilmen from the Big Texas, one which didn't involve a convenient rogue wave hitting the bridge at just the right time. Wizards from Círdan had likely kidnapped the oilmen. If Radner's theory was right, the Círdani surf catchers had managed to track their prey to the tanker, gotten irritated that they had lost 3 of their serfs, and grabbed 4 of the people on the boat to take their place in serfdom. What's even more frightening is that there was no way that the United States would have known about it, had it not been for the Círdani Chancellor's offhand remark that Altry had picked up 4 new serfs. He had sent Radner and as many Círdani-speaking wizards as he could over to the island to ascertain the truth. If those feudal lords had indeed abducted American citizens, heads were going to roll. He couldn't think about that right now, because his attention was focused entirely on the upcoming debate with Bob Dole. Dan Rather had been chosen to be the moderator. The world may have changed, but even Judgment Day would not have been enough to stop the next presidential election. Clinton had done everything he could to prepare for the debate. However, he had to admit that the country had suddenly found itself in a situation which had caught Americans completely off guard. A mere month ago, the world had been at peace for the most part, and the country had been focused on the Quabin terrorist attack. The president remembered thinking that at the time, it would likely be the most deadly terrorist attack for years to come. 7,000 people had died that day in the Quabin. 700,000 had died during Judgment Day in the United States alone, and God knew how America would deal with $3.50 gallon gas prices and a major economic slowdown which had, for all practical purposes, appeared out of nowhere. He looked around the room. He stood at the left end of the stage, and Senator Dole stood on the right. Dan Rather, the moderator, stood between them. Each man had a podium in front of him, and as far as he could tell, all 3 of them had come with reams and reams of notes. Rather had explained the format of the debate to them. People in the audience would raise their hands, and Rather would call upon them. The audience members would then ask questions, and both candidates would have a minute to respond. It was an interesting way to handle it in that the American people truly felt as if they were participating. The downside of it was the simple fact that neither candidate had any idea what they would be asking. Clinton was a bit nervous, and judging from what he saw at the other end of the stage, Dole didn't like it that much either. People had been flown in from all across the country. There had been a nationwide lottery for spaces in Independence Hall, and the winners had been awarded a 4th of July weekend in Philadelphia, punctuated by participation in the debate. There were men and women, rich and poor, red and blue. Everyone was there. Rather looked at both candidates and saw that everything was ready. He then introduced himself to the crowd and explained the rules of the debate. He advised the audience that each person would be allowed to submit one question, and only one, so they should think carefully about what they wanted to ask. The first person to raise his hand was a 20-something named William Dorn from Arlington Heights, Illinois. Gentlemen, what is your view of wizards? Do you trust them? What do you think of America for Humans' demands that they police themselves? Rather thanked the man for the question and turned to Clinton. Prior to coming on stage, Rather had flipped a coin to determine who would provide the first answer to the initial question. Clinton would answer the odd-number questions first, and Dole would answer the even-numbered questions first. Clinton thought this one was pretty easy. As President of the United States, I've worked with many wizards. Rest assured, that the vast majority of them are decent human beings, and I would trust them to do the right thing. Just look at people like Jelena Kurchatova, Hermione Granger, Guinevere de Mornay, and Dr. Radner. As far as policing themselves go, I would argue that they do a good enough job already. Voldemort appears to have been an anomaly, and we don't want to punish the entire wizarding community because of the actions of one madman. Rather nodded, and then turned to Dole. Dole admitted that he had not interacted as much with the wizards as Clinton had. However, he could attest to the fact that the vast majority of the wizards were trustworthy. He differed from the president, however, when it came to America for humans' demands. Looking directly at Dawn, he said, "Although 99% of the wizards are good, it takes only one wizard to cause an incident like Judgment Day. If I am elected president, I will work with Secretary Radner to develop a new screening protocol which will make sure we don't get any more Voldemorts. After all, safety and security are crucial, especially in times like this. We've gotten accustomed to security checks at airports, and I'm certain the wizards will be able to get accustomed to these new rules." The next question came from Javier Sechrist from Roanoke Rapids, North Carolina. Sechrist was a little older than Dawn, but not much. "How are you going to deal with the economic downturn? My wife lost her job a couple of days ago, and we have a 3-year-old son." Dole took this one first. "If I'm elected president, I'm going to reduce taxes and pledge to not add any more taxes. Read my lips, no new taxes. I'm going to cut corruption and wasteful spending in the government and put the money back in the pockets of the American taxpayer. That should improve consumer confidence and get the economy back on a solid footing again." Clinton had a different idea. "I believe the economy is still structurally sound and that people are in shock over the events of Judgment Day. A good 90% of the market is still there, and the New York Stock Exchange has been split between here and Boston. It's only a matter of time until everything returns to normal and people start returning to their jobs. I'm planning on issuing a 2-month holiday from federal taxes to help jumpstart spending. Finally, I plan to pursue a more isolationist foreign policy, where we don't spend all of our budget on defense." Pamela McBride from Roan Mountain, Tennessee, was next. "How are you going to combat Islamophobia in the heartland? I know several people in my town seem to think that all Muslims are terrorists who are members of Muslims for Humans, and I'm fairly certain that is not the case. Keep in mind, though, I'm not very familiar with Islam, and there aren't many Muslims where I come from." Clinton knew what to say here. Islam is a faith of peace and has been like that for over a millennium. Jihad means internal struggle against personal problems, not military action. If you want to see a Muslim, just look at Suleiman I, the Kohen Gadol, that is, the man chosen by Samuel to become the high priest of his universalist movement. He is a Muslim, and he risked his life to protect the Pope and dozens of pilgrims from Muslims for Humans. Dagher, the new Grand Mugwump, is also a practicing Muslim, and he served with distinction during the crisis in the Mideast. You may or may not know that Osama bin Laden, who claimed he followed Islam, was actually disowned by his Saudi family. Come to think of it, look at King Fahd, who is trying to atone for the actions he was forced to do while under the Imperious Curse. And don't forget Mubarak, who helped save the world." Dole agreed with most of Clinton's remarks. He added that he would make a concerted effort to focus on discrimination against Muslims, Celestines, and Samuelists in the United States. He also brought up the story of Saladin, the man who was seen as the hand of the devil during the Crusades, but who was in fact one of the most honorable and chivalrous men the Crusaders ever encountered. If anything, the Crusaders were likely more barbaric than the occupants of the Holy Land. The debate went on for a while. As far as Clinton could tell, both sides had held their ground. He supposed he couldn't have expected anything else. He thought back to his comment about increased isolationism. If he attacked Círdan and got bogged down their fighting wizards, that could turn on him in a hurry. Isolationism was still a good idea, and Clinton thought a Searden campaign would be a relatively brief affair, as the wizards knew nothing about Muggle weapons. Then again, so had a bunch of European nations in 1914.